How you doing, everybody? My name is Khalid Alston, third year naturopathic medical student, and today we're going to be talking about fecal transplants. I know this is your favorite topic while you guys are eating. It's intentional because at the end we are all going to be giving some samples. Whoa! Just joking. Just joking. Don't worry. All right. So first to really understand the application and the science behind fecal transplants, I think it's important for us to take a step back and kind of get a collective understanding on what the microbiome actually is, because it's a term that we hear used a lot nowadays, but it's really hard to understand actually what the microbiome is. So the microbiome is the community that lives inside of our bodies and on our skin. And this community includes everything from bacteria to parasites to viruses, fungi, archaea. All of these guys and gals, they live inside of us and on our bodies. And the crazy thing is, especially if you think about how small they are, if you take all of these little microorganisms and put them into a ball and throw them on a scale, it would weigh about 4 pounds, which, at least to me, is pretty wild. And conventional knowledge tells us that bacteria, fungi, viruses, all these things are bad. But what we're now learning with science is that that's not actually the case, because it's actually a lot more complicated than that, especially because if you think about it, these bacteria, these microorganisms have been around since the beginning of time. And we as a species evolved alongside of them. And so if you think about, for example, our immune system does not function properly if we have a state of dysbiosis, because our immune system has been made to function in the presence of these microorganisms. So in order for us to have optimal health, we need to have optimal gut bacteria, urogeneral bacteria, whatever it is, we need to have a proper relationship with these microorganisms. We all know about the gut, but we have organisms in our mouths, in our urogeneral tract, in our nose, and in our skin. They're everywhere. And they have a lot of positive functions. They help us create vitamins, synthesize vitamins. They help us metabolize hormones. They help with dietary. They help us metabolize what we eat. I'm saying that as in the least scientific way possible, but they help us in a lot of ways. And the best analogy that I've heard thus far to help me understand what the microbiome actually is to think of a coral reef or just like an ecosystem. So if you think of a coral reef, you have this community that lives underwater in a very, very delicate balance, in a very delicate symbiotic balance with everything around it, right? And any slight change in that environment can drastically alter the makeup and the fundamental makeup of that ecosystem. So if the temperature goes up a little bit, then you may kill some of the living organisms within the coral reef, and that will disrupt the balance. The same thing happens within our microbiome. If you change your diet, you change the amount that you exercise, if you take different medications, whether they be antibiotics or non-antibiotics, that is going to shift your microbiome and can have some pretty drastic impacts on your microbiome. And that can have some downstream effects on your health, whether it be positive or negative. And as we move on to the topic of poop, which is why you all came here, which is what we all will be depositing when we leave, is every time you poop, if you think about it, you're dropping off a little community of microorganisms. It's what it is. It's like a little community of microorganisms inside your poop. And the whole idea of fecal transplants is that we can take a healthy community, put it into a pill, or put it into a tube, put it into somebody else's body, and hopefully through competitive balance, the healthy microorganisms can help to repopulate an unhealthy microbiome with a better balance. And that can have a lot of positive impacts on health, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so I'm just curious, when do you guys think the first fecal transplant was recorded, or the first fecal transplants happened?
1000 BC.
Closer to that, yeah. So I thought Egypt originally, it was actually in ancient China.
Oh.
So they had this thing called yellow soup. I tried to get Christine to order it today. They don't have it at Elephants, apparently, but yellow soup was poop that they turned into a stew, and they fed it to people to help with diarrhea and with fever, abdominal pain, and all this stuff. Yeah. It's disgusting, right? They weren't the only ones. In the 1940s, German military, they actually ate camel poop as a treatment for infectious gastroenteritis. In 1957, that was the first reported modern use of fecal capsules. Dr. Fecal, I meant to Google how to say it. I really don't know. But Dr. Fecal, he was the first one to use oral capsules. He had pre-surgical patients. He gave them oral fecal transplants prior to giving them antibiotics. He noticed drastic improvements in their post-surgical outcomes and their symptoms. He was fired because he gave his patients poop, and that you're not supposed to do that. But that was the first recorded record of that. A year later, another doctor had a similar thought process, and he gave 4 patients with pseudomembranous colitis. He gave them enemas of fecal material, and he saw 100% improvement. Yeah. And then over the next 10 years, he gave another about 16 transplants. He saw improvement in over 90% of the patients. And what we now know is that he was actually treating C. diff, and so was the previous doctor. That's what they were unknowingly treating. And that brings us to C. diff, Clostridium difficile, if I said that correctly. And as you may or may not know, this is currently the only medically approved treatment or condition that you can use fecal transplants for. So you cannot legally, as a doctor, allopathic or naturopathic, give fecal transplants for anything other than C. diff. C. diff is the most commonly acquired hospital illness. If you get C. diff, you're going to have watery diarrhea, you're going to have stomach ache, you're going to have nausea. It's not that fun. It's not fun for us, but it's deadly for old people. So if you have, which is why it's really important that if somebody's in the hospital and they do acquire C. diff, they get treatment as soon as possible. High rates of morbidity and mortality. I am not going to go through this in detail, but the moral of the story is that current standard of care dictates that patients who have C. diff, which is a result most often of antibiotics, undergo at least 2 to 3 courses of antibiotics to try to get rid of the C. diff. Standard of care does not always make sense. But this is the standard protocol. After you failed two rounds of antibiotics, at least 2 rounds of antibiotics, then you can be diagnosed with recurrent C. diff, and you become eligible for stool transplants. So, the different ways that you can get a stool transplant, if you've been approved or if you're lucky enough to have recurrent C. diff, you can get it orally via capsules. You can get it through your rectum and with an enema or colonoscopy. The grossest way, which I think, is a nasal tube. I don't know. Yeah, it sounds worse than the soup. But this study down here talks about or compares the efficacy for these capsules versus the colonoscopy. As you can imagine, a capsule is a lot safer than a colonoscopy, and it is actually now recommended that you do a colonoscopy over the capsules over the colonoscopy because it is just as safe and it's just as effective. I found it pretty funny, and I highlighted this on the bottom on the right side. This was from that study, and they did a pre and post survey with the patients, and the patients classified or described the fecal transplants as an innovative treatment, as a natural therapy, and they also called it unpleasant, gross, and disgusting. So, yeah, getting somebody else's food is unpleasant, gross, and disgusting, but every one of them said that they would do it again if medically necessary, and a large portion of people who thought it was disgusting got it rectally. people who had the capsules, they had a slightly better experience. Which makes sense, at least maybe just for me. So, the next question is, who can donate, right? Or where do you get this poop from? It comes from real people. They're trying to manufacture synthetic poop right now in the pharmaceutical world. But until that happens, we are still using real poop. So the question now becomes, who can donate? And so I'm curious with everybody here. I want you guys to pay attention to the requirements that are going to come up on the board at the end. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you're still eligible to be a stool donor. All right, this is for Dr. Macbeth's stool bank in Portland, Oregon. So, do you eat a whole food diet? Do you eat a healthy diet? Minimal antibiotics? Are you on any active medications? Have you had little or no antibiotic use over your entire life? Or no recent antibiotic use as well? Do you have any mental health issues? Do you have a stable and healthy body weight? What is a stable and healthy body weight? But that's another conversation. Okay. Do you have any autoimmune diseases? Were you breastfed as a child? Were you born vaginally? Yeah. So how many of you guys are still eligible to donate stool to this bank? Yeah, very, very few of you. Your stool is very valuable. It really is. Dr. Macbeth's stool bank is not the only bank. There's Open Biome. Open Biome is in Boston. It was the first public stool bank. They distribute stool to practitioners all around the world. Microbioma is another stool bank. Smart life for my brother. Microbiome is it's not a stool bank, but is a platform that works to connect donors and individuals who want stool. Their job is their platform, their goal is to connect these people, because as you'll learn on the next slide, it's very hard to find poop, or people who want to give you their poop. And the reason why I said you guys' poops are so valuable, if you can read the fine print, Microbiome will give you $400 a month if you are an eligible stool donor. Yeah. And I'm not going to lie, as I was putting this presentation together, I've seriously started considering donating poop, because I poop a lot and So, anyway. This right here is the story of Michael. I heard a story on a podcast called The Perfect Stool. And you can't really read that in the top right corner, but he's given himself 9 fecal transplants. He's been on disability for the past 10 years. He has chronic IBS. He has palpitation. He has debilitating fatigue. And he uses, in his mind, fecal transplants are like the only viable treatment. But he doesn't have C. diff, so it's not medically approved. So he has had to go around and beg people for their poop. And this right here is a list of some of the things that he's tried, some of the places he's gone looking for poop. He's gone to campuses like a creep with flyers and has asked people for their poop. He has signed up for dating websites like OkCupid and Tinder with the intention of meeting people and eventually asking them for their poop. He's gone to CrossFit and has emailed athletes to try to acquire their poop. He even went to, most interestingly, at least to me, is that he went to he went to blood banks to try to find stool donors. And that's a population that you think would be open to giving poop. But none of them were healthy enough to give them his poop. And so, again, that has the comparison with what is required to give blood and versus stool. And as we kind of look towards the future, if I had any advice for this little Hershey kiss right here, I would tell him and his friends to really start to invest in themselves, because stool is a very promising medicine. There's a lot of money that's going to be coming into stool-related therapies, and there's a lot of therapeutic benefit that can be given to patients. And if you look at this list right here, it's just a small list, but there are currently 285 active trials going on exploring the treatment of all these diseases with fecal transplants. So some of them include obesity, cancer, ulcerative colitis, urinary tract infections, HIV, Parkinson's, cirrhosis, diabetes. The list is really long, and the implications are pretty vast. And as we kind of shift towards the current research in fecal transplants, we need to give a quick shout out to, as Dr. Chamberlain likes to call them, the altruistic, selfless volunteer mice, right? So what you're looking at right here, these are called germ-free mice, right? And so these are mice that have been born and bred in an environment that is completely sterile. So they've never been exposed to any external bacteria or viruses. So their entire environment from conception to growth has been completely sterile. This is important because this allows scientists to then give them things like probiotics and fecal transplants, and to scientifically be able to establish causation in terms of the differences that they see in what happens pre and post fecal transplants. Some interesting studies that I came across. So, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We've all been taught that fatty liver is a consequence of obesity, a poor diet, and metabolic dysfunction. Right? You have these risk factors when you're going to develop fatty liver. What science is now showing us is that it's actually slightly more complicated than that. So what they did, this is a slightly older slide. The one that I just updated, which isn't up there, it has a picture of an obese mouse in the top right. Because they frequently talk about obese mice, and I was just really curious what they look like, and I found a picture of an obese mouse. It looks exactly how it sounds, just like a really, really big mouse with really small feet. They can't really go anywhere because they have small legs, but they're obese mice. And so what they did was they took two, or maybe more than two, but they took obese mice and they fed them high-fat diets, right? And they identified two mice that had very different responses to the high-fat diet. One mouse was fed the high-fat diet and they developed hyperglycemia. Another mouse who was fed the high-fat diet had no adverse complications. They then gave germ-free mice a transplant, a microbiota transplant from these two host mice, right? So the mouse that had the adverse reaction, they called the responder. The mouse that did not have the adverse response was called the non-responder. They gave these transplants to these germ-free mice, and they fed those germ-free mice a high-fat diet. Then they looked at the consequences. The germ-free mice who were fed the high-fat diet, the one who got the stool from the responder, they developed hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, and microvesicular steatosis, which, as we all know, is the beginnings of fatty liver disease. The other mouse who received the other stool had no adverse complications. And so this kind of gets back to, again, the etiology, the causes of these diseases, and it helps us kind of put some context to why some people may be able to eat anything they want and never gain a pound, never have any weight issues, metabolic issues, while some other people can look at a French fry and talk about how they gain weight. And it may not be as simple as just saying, hey, eat different food. Maybe we need to get back to the gut and try to, again, get back to this balance of the good versus bad bacteria in their bodies. Cancer. There's a lot of implications for cancer treatment and fecal transplants. As most of us know, again, a very big target of chemotherapy and radiation is our intestinal mucosa, because our intestinal cells, they frequently turn over, right? And cancer therapies target those cells that frequently turn over because they're trying to kill the metastatic cells, right? And as a result, cancer patients often have a lot of GI issues. So this study looked at the effects of radiation on the microbiome and fecal transplants. They again took volunteer mice, only the ones that voluntarily signed up, and they gave some of these mice radiation, and some of these mice did not receive radiation therapy. They then did another transplant and gave the transplant to these germ-free mice. And they gave these germ-free mice radiation. Lucky them. what they found were that the mice who received a transplant from the stools that had previously been exposed to radiation, they had shorter lifespans, they had worse GI damage, and they had worse symptoms as compared to the mice who did not receive those transplants. They had longer lifespans and less symptoms. They took this a step further and then gave mice who had been exposed to radiation, they gave them a transplant of a healthy microbiome. And then they exposed them to radiation again. And in that second round, they found that even these mice had less complications and had longer lifespans than those mice who had never been given a healthy gut microbiome. So again, there's a really big connection between the gut and our health that isn't fully explored. I didn't really go into detail on this here, but there's also this whole world of cancer immunotherapy. I didn't put it on the board because I don't fully understand it, but there are patients who fail immunotherapy for various reasons. And after given a fecal transplant, their immune system can switch from, let's say, a T1 to a T2. Don't quote me on that because that's not because the actual cytokines I'm quoting are not correct, but they can shift their immune response, which will allow them to better respond to the cancer therapies. So there's a lot of potential here. Gut-brain axis. Again, your gut is your second brain. There's a lot of, if you talk to doctors, you talk to patients who've received fecal transplants, you'll hear a lot of them talking about spontaneous remission of depression. And this has, again, been shown in these germ-free mice, where if you give a germ-free mouse the biome of a depressed mouse or a depressed person, that they will start to have altered tryptophan pathways, which will affect their serotonin production. They will also start to express symptoms and signs of anxiety. Signs of anxiety in a mouse, I guess they just run around in circles, but they start to express signs of anxiety. And this can be further extended to other mental health conditions like Alzheimer's, autism, bipolar, schizophrenia. All these conditions and more have been implicated to have very different and very unique microbiomes. And so if we can start to try to approach some of these conditions from the gut or from a microbiome perspective, we can really give some benefit while avoiding a lot of these really damaging drugs. This is the last study that I'll highlight. This was a case study for a 46-year-old insulin-dependent type 2 diabetic with diabetic neuropathy. She was given 2 fecal transplants and reported significant improvements in her pain. She no longer needed NSAIDs. Her glucose management, her glucose tolerance improved, and again, had no adverse effects. So as we kind of look towards the future, there's no question that there's a lot of potential in fecal transplants, but there are still a lot of questions that we need to answer. For example, like, what is a healthy donor? How do you properly screen donors? Where do you get them from? What is actually transmissible via a stool sample, right? So studies have very, very positive safety profiles. There's very, very few safety concerns reported in these studies. But what else isn't reported? Like, can you acquire somebody's food sensitivities or allergies? Michael, in the podcast, he was talking about how he developed a sensitivity to sweet potatoes after one of his fecal transplants. Are you going to pick up somebody's autoimmune disease? Are you going to, is it going to alter your personality, right? All of these kind of underlying things that allopathic medicine just doesn't pay attention to, that we do. We believe in sensitivities. How does that impact my stool transplants? How about treatment consistency? What if you need long-term fecal transplants and your donor isn't available throughout the entire course of your treatment? Is your therapeutic outcome going to vary depending on the quality of the stool donor? Again, I have no idea. Finance, more money, more problem. I was talking to Dr. Andrea Macbeth, and I remember how I said that oral capsules are indicated and are actually recommended on Up to Date. She was saying that a lot of allopathic gastroenterologists perform FMTs via colonoscopy because insurance, or they can't get the same insurance reimbursement from capsules as they would from a colonoscopy. So they only perform them via colonoscopy for financial implications, for financial reasons. It's kind of sad. Donor honesty. If I can get $400 and just lie about taking an antibiotic one time, am I going to do it? Is that going to have negative health impacts? And how do you monitor somebody's stool to see if they actually have had antibiotics? Can you actually do that? And that's the end. I'm just going to give a quick shout out to Dr. Macbeth. She's the person whose lecture I originally attended on fecal transplants. If you want a fecal transplant or if you have questions about fecal transplants, she's the one you should ask. I can answer some questions, but I'm a student, so I can't give medical advice unless you're my sibling. Also, quick shout out to Science on Tap. This is where I went to attend this lecture. It was actually pretty cool. It cost me $12 as a student. They have beer. I think a few people here in here might have attended. It was $12. It was beer. There was food. It was a fun crowd, and you don't have to pay $200-$300 to attend a science conference to learn something. And that's all. Questions?
Do you know how big the dosage is?
For what?
If you don't.
So it'll probably vary. For C. diff, it's 30 capsules, 10 capsules a day for 3 days. And within the capsule, so right here, 30 capsules, about 2.5 grams per capsule. 10 caps 3 times a day. And that's probably hard for somebody to do who may be elderly or have some dysphagia, difficulty swallowing. It may be difficult for them to do, at which point you may have to do it rectally. Lizzie? I think it's pretty long because I don't know for sure, but if you look at the bottom right picture, it looks like you can, if they're frozen, you can store them for pretty long. I can't verify that, but that's just my interpretation of the picture. And then I imagine maybe if you encapsulate it, then that decreases the shelf life. You probably take that, defrost it, and then encapsulate it. Gloria.
I'm wondering if you know specifically how the FMT works differently than just the probiotics, and since we know that the microbiome is being established by 3 years old, does this actually work on reestablishing a microbiome, or is it like probiotics where you give it like does a little bit of a change, and then it has to be given?
Well, in comparison to probiotics, the idea of fecal transplant in the most fundamental way is just like a supercharged atomic bomb of microorganisms, right? So when we are manufacturing probiotics in labs, we can't reproduce all the strains that are found in somebody's gut. So when you take a fecal transplant, you are literally picking up an ecosystem. You're picking up somebody's coral reef and putting that entire reef into somebody else's body, rather than picking up a piece of algae and a fish and putting them in the capsule and hoping that those two things can alone make that big of an impact. So fecal transplants have a much broader and wider implication and health benefits for probiotics. I think as we learn more about different strains, you start to see that probiotics are including more and more diverse strains of bacteria and fungi. And some, like for example, some probiotic companies will have fungi and some don't. Some will contain parasites, some won't. Whereas if you're taking the stool, you're getting everything, the good, the bad, and you're putting it in there. And I guess mechanistically, there is a concept of competitive exclusion, where if you have more of the good guys doing their job, then they help to push out some of the bad guys. And so it's the more of the good guys you can get in there, the better chance you have at getting rid of the bad guys.
So can you eat a regular diet after you have the FMT?
I believe I don't think there are any dietary restrictions. I didn't look into that. My best answer to that would be is if you do have gut dysbiosis for any reason, if you get a transplant and then go back to the standard American diet, then you are going to have very short-lived responses. But if you get a transplant and change your diet and eat a diet that is high in fiber and high in foods that promotes the growth and the maintenance of the bacteria, then I imagine you have longer treatment outcomes.
So with coordination, like I don't remember how many times I was on antibiotics as a child or whatnot. Do they pull all of your medical records?
It's going to vary. It's going to vary. So some, for example, in Europe, you're allowed to do fecal transplants for things other than C. diff. And so they have more banks out there. The requirements are not as stringent. The requirements for open biome are different than the requirements for the stool bank here in Portland. Again, their requirements I think are not as strong as Dr. Macbeth's are. And a lot of it is based off of survey data. You know, you obviously can screen somebody for infectious diseases, but you can't really objectively screen them for mental health conditions or some autoimmune conditions unless you're going to run a $1,000 payment on every person who wants to donate.
So as far as you know, they don't pull your entire past medical records.
Not that I know.
Okay.
Schmidt.
On that top one, do you happen to know how long you need to be on that, right?
I don't. But I can ask, and it's probably just overall just a healthy lifestyle, healthy diet. You know, because again, you know, if you're eating high processed foods, low fiber, you're going to have a very different balance and makeup of microorganisms in your body. And yeah, you know, high fermented food, you're going to have different organisms.
For these research studies for like the mice, the new mice, the shrimp mice, as well as the human studies, are they looking at indirect measures of changes in the microbiome, like looking at some pictures versus actual stool, like ribosome like RNA, that actually genetically test what colonies are staying in the microbiome after?
Some are, some aren't. I'd say it would vary depending on the study, and I can send you all the studies. I know you love reading these articles. So I'll send you a bunch. Some do, some don't. You know, it's again that's part of the future in terms of being able to shift the research from mice to humans. So you can see that so we can try to figure out which strains will be able to stick around after a fecal transplant in an actual human. You know?
Yeah, and like what the before and after pictures are, like the disease for the individual with the condition has, and what their microbiome is to start with, and then how it shifts through the transplant, and then down the line, like after a few months, and where the colonies.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting to try to figure out, again, like, what are the SIGs or the treatment protocols for these transplants? Like, are they one-time shots? Are there some conditions that need chronic, like, fecal transplants every couple months? You know, how many transplants does it take, like you said, to completely re-inoculate a gut?
Yeah, and I think the difference with the probiotics versus FMT is the fact that FMT, though they have bacterial species that actually repopulate and colonize the gut, whereas probiotics, I think that they're just deactivated cell membrane pieces that stimulate the bacteria that's already there and activate the immune system that's already in there. So live versus fragments of probiotics provide micro.
Did you hear that, Gloria?
Some of it.
Yell first, Julia.
I think the difference between FMT and probiotics are that in FMT
FMT have live organisms capable of actually colonizing the gut, whereas in probiotics, most of those are deactivated fragments of microbe cell membrane that you take and it's delivered to your gut, and those fragments have the antigens that activate and trigger your immune system response. So that trains your like T-regs and macrophages down there. So you're not actually, like with probiotic supplementation, you're not colonizing. Whereas with FMT, I think you are. They stick around and they make a home. Like your ecosystem, nothing more.
Any other questions?
Just in terms of like the other physiological benefits or effects, like other than maybe like weight loss, or is there like promoted, let's say, hair growth, or is there any other things that you wouldn't expect that the microbiome would impact on the body's physiology?
It's when you start looking at the microbiome and its connection to the entire body, it's pretty vast. Like the microbiome is connected to every body system. And when you start looking, it's kind of researching the non-scientific blogosphere on the internet. You'll see people using stool as facials. You know? There's actually companies like L'Oreal, for example, modern day cosmetic companies are now culturing bacteria and including bacteria in their facial and skincare lines because, again, when you talk about like other applications for the microbiome, you have a microbiome on your skin, right? And the pH of your skin is purposefully slightly acidic because it acts as a barrier for some of the pathogenic bacteria that don't like acidic environments. When you use a lot of the skin products, they change the pH of your skin and therefore make it make it a better environment for bad bacteria like staph that you don't want on your skin, right? And that's an implication for how an altered skin microbiome can result in negative skin diseases or skin manifestations. And companies are now looking at that and saying, okay, well maybe if we can put some of these probiotic strains, and maybe we can put some of these bacterial strains into our skin products, that can help promote a healthy microbiome. In terms of hair, I don't know. There's possibility we can give our dad his hair back, and I'm sure he would be the happiest guy in the world. Whoever invents the solution to hair loss is going to be a very, very successful guy. Or a woman.
Thank you.
Most likely a woman, because you guys are way smarter than this.
Amen to that.
You said that depending on the area that you live, there are different criteria for donating. And do you know what the the stool bank is for Portland to donate?
So there are to my knowledge, Open Biome is the only public, or one of the few public stool banks, which means they take stool, and they give it to practitioners all across the nation. The stool bank that I'm talking about, that's on the page right now, Dr. Macbeth, she's a naturopathic physician, and she has a clinic, and she has her own small stool bank, where she takes donations from. She pays people to give her their stool. She takes it, she encapsulates it, and she uses it for her own patients. So she doesn't give it to clinicians around the U.S. And so her requirements are going to differ from those for Open Biome.
Okay, so the open biome is more just like the broad general.
Open Biome is more of a broad, general, probably one of the first and one of the largest stool banks that provide stools for hospitals and clinicians around the world. Yeah. And then microbioma is relatively new, I think within the past 6 months, and they connect stool donors and patients. They don't include doctors, but technically doctors can't really be involved in it. They can't give fecal transplants. But the purpose of microbiome is to try to make the process easier for someone like Michael who had to go to college campuses to ask people for their poop. You know, again, their screening process is going to be different. Question to make money. Any other questions?
What's the international waters like on like research about microbiome? Is the states pushing more like research and R&D development, clinical organizations for FMT, or is that?
I'm not entirely sure. There is so much research. Like, I got research overload when I was looking at FMT, and like all the articles were like 2017 and newer. The FMT is legal outside of the states for things other than C. diff. So I imagine there's more research and more empiric evidence from clinics outside of the states. But those 285 studies that I referenced before, those, to my knowledge, are all within the U.S. that are currently happening.
Sorry, one more related question to that. And so, in regards to crossing country lines and whatnot, is this something that people would be able to expect more than?
You have to go to, so fecal material is federally regulated by the FDA.
Okay.
So state by state, the laws are all the same. You can't, states in Oregon are no different than states in Boston. The laws in Oregon are no different than the laws in Boston. But if you go to Mexico or Argentina, you can do whatever you want for the United States.
And is there any sharing between Europe and the US or anything of fecal matter? Or no, is there any different microbiomes?
So there are definitely going to be different microbiomes depending on where you live, the people you're around. But you may, honestly, there may be a healthier microbiome in Europe than the one that you get in the States. I have no idea. And you could get feces from another country. The way they ship feces is on dry ice. Like, put it in some other package and they put it on dry ice and ship it. It would just be more expensive to ship it across the country. I don't know how customs would take that. We can do some research on that. You know, it's a little bit away.
I had a lot of questions about that. If it's properly labeled, it'll set that.
Yeah.
I should stem cells across
Yeah.
internationally.
If it's taken, then you just do it again. And hope it slips through the cracks.
That's what it usually does.
No pun intended.